Thank you. Okay, so I will a little bit introduce myself, add few information to what was said. So I am from the Department of Spatial Sciences. We focus on spatial, on space, on mostly on spatial ecology or environmental applications or environmental science, let's say. What I am doing for years is that I serve as a kind of data analyst or statistician in the department. So I collaborate on many diverse projects from spatial ecology, from remote sensing applications, and so on. And what I will present today is my first serious attempt to do my own topic and to do my own research. And because I am focused more on methods, I have a background in ecology and in environmental modeling, but I am more focused on methods than on the biology itself. So even my research that I'm going to present is methodological. So I warn you in the beginning, but maybe you recognized it from the title itself. And yeah, I will speak a lot about spatial autocorrelation today because it's the major issue in spatial statistics or in analyzing spatial data. And because I see that there is many students, which I didn't expect in the very beginning when I started preparing this, I would like to ask you if you can raise your hand who ever heard before you saw this title, who ever heard the term spatial autocorrelation? Okay, so most of you did, which is great, but some of you didn't. Okay, so I will explain it. Have any of you heard the term randomization? Maybe yes, because it's, yeah, some of you. Okay, so feel free to stop me if you don't understand something. What I really feel uncomfortable when I feel that the audience is not with me. So I will stop myself when I will see it, but I don't see you so much because you're very far. So but feel free to stop me and ask me to explain anything again slowly. I have even some markers here, and I can use the board to explain anything. Okay, so let's start. So the outline is very simple. I will introduce some problem, then I will introduce a solution. It should be the solution if it's the problem, and then I will give you, at the end, I will give you a real data example. But most of the time, it will be, I have pictures of plants there and so on. But it will most be some graphs or plots. It will mostly be simulated data. So that comes out of my computer and not from field. But at the end, there will be real data examples. So you may be kind of motivated to stay with me to the end. Okay, thanks. Good point. It's here, I guess. No. F5, no. F11, no. Okay. Control L, yeah. So let's start with the problem section with this also artificial motivation example. So consider you have some species that you're interested in. Might be a plant species, might be whatever else. And you're interested in its relationship with something else, with maybe some environmental conditions, maybe some climatic conditions, like here, maybe with precipitation. You might want to know whether the species kind of is dependent and how it is dependent on this variable. In our department, we do a lot of species distribution modeling, and this is exactly what you're doing if you want to map the distribution or the expected distribution of the species in space. Usually you base this on its relationship to some environmental conditions for which you have data. And in this example, the data are actually simulated, as I warned you in the beginning. But you may consider this to be some kind of characteristics of the distribution of the plant. It may be its abundance, for example, or it may be. You may also consider multiple species and species richness being represented in the pictures, or functional richness, or phylogenetical richness, whatever you want. But it's a continuous variable, so quantitative variable. So red means more species or more higher abundance, let's say. Green means less, and so on. And you have, in the same area, you have the information about, let's say, precipitation. And now you want to investigate whether they are related together or not. So what you usually do, you go to the field and you sample both these variables, or maybe the precipitation you have in a raster form downloaded from internet, so you don't have to sample it. But the species, you have to go to the field and sample the abundance, for example. So you do this in some points in space, maybe randomly distributed, as you are in this room. And then you have pairs of measurement, the abundance of the species at the point and the precipitation at the same point, and you can plot them in this way. And frequently you can see something like this. If you are lucky, you see some nice relationship in this. Case, it's a more or less linear relationship, and you can fit some statistical model to it to quantify the relationship and to assess its significance. So there is some nonlinear regression fitted to it, but you can easily fit, it's clear, a linear regression, and I'm pretty sure that the slope would be significant. You may be happy, but there is one problem here. And the problem is called spatial autocorrelation, because it is obvious from these pictures that both of these variables are spatially structured. They are not, the values of precipitation and the values of species abundance, they are not distributed kind of randomly, like white noise, that at one place it would be precipitation of some value, and if you move a little bit, there will be completely different value. No, they changes smoothly over space. So the value of the variable here and somewhere near will be similar. They are dependent. And this violates one of the basic assumptions in statistics, that for most of the statistical methods, you expect that the data are independent. This is what is expected in the term random sample. So here the data are not independent, and it creates something called sometimes pseudo-replication, because if you sample some variable here, and then you sample the same variable here, but it is strongly autocorrelated, you are basically sampling twice the same. So it's basically just one piece of information, but you take it twice. So your sample looks large, but it is actually the effective sample, we may say, is much lower. So, in other words, is this relationship really significant if we consider the spatial autocorrelation? And you may also think about it in a different way. You may be worried whether this relationship is a result of real structural relationship between these two variables. It means that the plant really responds to precipitation because it needs water, or isn't it just an effect of overlaying these two highly structured, highly autocorrelated surfaces over each other? Because if you imagine that you just overlay them, because they are so structured, they will kind of go one with the other one. No, they will create this, like if one increases from one side to the other side and the other one as well, if you overlay them, they will go together And if you sample it, then you will see the relationship. But it's maybe just an accident of overlaying highly correlated variables over each other. So it's just a different look on the same problem. So from one point of view, you may think that it's a dependence and it's like a pseudo-replication. On the other hand, it's overlaying two structured variables. It's the same. And actually, this plot is really made from these two simulated surfaces that I sampled. I put there 100 random points, randomly distributed, and it created this plot. And these two surfaces actually are simulated completely independent on each other. So there is no structural relationship between them. But anyway, it created this very convincing plot that anyone who is not aware of the problem of spatial autocorrelation would immediately go and publish it because it's highly significant. So, in other words, if you see this and the data are coming from space and there is a spatial autocorrelation, you cannot be sure whether it's a structural relationship, which can be direct causal effect that really the plant responds to precipitation, or indirect causal effect. It may be a different variable that is not a real causal, has no real causal effect on the species, but is correlated with something that has this effect. So it's still something I would call structural relationship, or if it's just an accidental spatial association. So I hope this motivated enough your concern or your interest. So it's a real problem. And it is documented very nicely by many papers, but I selected two of them that are especially interesting. And the first of them, from Chapman from 2010, is also about plants, so it fits here very well. There was this paper, Weak Climatic Associations Among British Plant Distributions, which was highly debated, and because it was kind of disturbing, because Chapman took 100 UK plants or plant species from some database of UK species that is in 10 times 10 kilometers grid, and he tried to explain the distribution using 23 climatic variables that are usually used in species distribution modeling to explain the distribution of the species. It worked well, not surprisingly, but what he then did, that he simulated completely fake variables with the same spatial structure, same autocorrelation properties as the original climatic variables, but these fake variables were anyhow were not related to the species at all. And he tried to explain the distribution with these fake predictors. And what he found was, unfortunately, that he was able to explain it equally well, almost equally well, with these fake predictors, which raises a big concern, a big doubt about, okay, are these found relationships between the species and climate, isn't it also fake if we can do the same with completely fake variables? And he used a variety of models for that, GLMs, random forests. Do you know what is random forests? No, it's a kind of very flexible statistical model by which you can model any kind of nonlinear relationships, and it has almost no distributional assumptions compared to classical methods like GLMs. Yeah, I think doesn't matter too much. He just used different modeling techniques for that. And what is important, he used the classical models, but he also used something that we call spatial models that are especially designed for accounting for that spatial autocorrelation. So they are supposed to solve the issue, to include the spatial autocorrelation somehow into the modeling. I will speak about it a little bit more after a while. Yeah, and what he found is, yeah, this is just a picture about how he simulated the simulated variables. So in each row, there is the first picture always is the original climatic variable, and these are the fake simulated ones. So he simulated much more of them. It's just like examples of 2. And the fact that they are similar to this one is expressed here in the so-called semi-variogram or variogram, which is a term that I'm not sure if I should try to explain it now, but it basically describes the spatial autocorrelation. So on the axis you have distance between, let's say, 2 points, and if you go from 0 up, then the spatial autocorrelation decreases. So the higher the function is, or the line is, the less autocorrelated the variable is. So of course, if you have small distance between the points, there is a high autocorrelation, so the function is low. And if you increase the distance between the 2 points, the values of the variable is more and more independent, less and less autocorrelated. But maybe this will be more clear later, and this is not so important now. It's just showing the original variogram of the original variable, and then the simulated new fake variables were simulated so that their variograms more or less match the original one. And this is more important. These are the results of his findings. On this plot, you always have on the y-axis the proportion of significant models. He fitted many models for the individual species with different predictors and so on, and he counted how many models were significant, and these are only with the fake predictors. So you should expect, if it's a fake predictor, it should not be related to the response, to the plant. So there should be like almost nothing significant. You may expect that there will be, let's say, 5% of them significant just by chance. That's what statistics says, but no more. And you can see that there's like more than 80% of them. So basically, almost all of them were significant. And he just plotted this against many, many variables. I don't think we need to go through it. And you can also see the difference between non-spatial models and 2 kinds of spatial models: trans-surface models and autocovariate models. Maybe I will speak about it later, what it means. But you can see that including, like, using statistical models that are especially designed for that problem, little bit improved the situation, but it didn't solve it. So now it's not like 80% significant, but it's still about 50%, and not 5%. And even here, okay, the autocovariate models were even better, but still, it might be even like 50% of them significant. There was another paper some years after, in 2018, from Fourcade, Besnard, and Secondi, who made something even more crazy. They used famous paintings to explain the distribution of species. In this case, it wasn't only plant species, it was all kinds of species, or possible, not all, but many taxa. It was almost 500 species from European Red List. And yeah, they used real environmental predictors and paintings. And basically they found the same This is just a workflow how they use the paintings. So they took the painting, they mapped it into Europe. This is another painting mapped into Europe, and then they used more paintings for each model. Like you use more predictors, like you may use, I don't know, precipitation, temperature, air pressure, whatever you want. So you have usually multiple predictors, and then because they could be correlated, they use the principal component analysis and put it into the model. And what is crazy here that this column is for real predictors. AUC, it's a measure of model performance. The closer it is to 1, the better the model is. The performance of real predictors was 0.83, which is not striking, but it's okay. It means that it works. It's something else than significance here. They didn't use significance approach, but they used AUC. So the models worked relatively good, let's say. But the AUC of these paintings was even higher, a little bit, more or less the same. So again, the paintings were successful in the same way as environmental predictors, which is kind of scary, isn't it? So, and this was like many years after like plenty of studies of species distribution modeling, and now these papers are saying your results from your species distribution models are maybe totally useless because you may do the same with completely fake variables. And what the problem behind this, obviously, even for example in this paper they have a large discussion about what could be the problem, but I think that the problem is clear. It's the spatial autocorrelation, because what enables you to explain one variable by completely non-related variable is that they are both spatially structured, and you overlay them, and then you find a relationship between them. So yeah, so that's basically the problem. I will now just explain a little bit more something about spatial autocorrelation and what is a spatial autocorrelation scale, because I need it for what will come next. So here I generated some surfaces, or let's say distribution of simulated variable in some square plot, and with different levels of spatial autocorrelation. And here on this picture you see the so-called spatial autocorrelation function, which is actually a function that describes how the spatial autocorrelation decreases with the distance. It's the same concept as I was trying to explain with the variograms before. And actually the variogram is nothing else than this curve, because here on this y-axis you have correlation coefficient, or correlation. You know what is correlation, right? Here we consider only positive values, but it could be also negative. But for spatial autocorrelation, the thing is that if the things are close, they are more similar. If they are more further, they are less dependent, let's say. So the correlation between them decreases with the distance, and this is exactly what this function describes. And you may measure this function even from the data, so you won't have such a nice smooth function. You would have like points for different pairs of points with different distances. We call this correlogram, and this is like one of the ways how to check whether your real data have spatial autocorrelation or not. But then you can also model it using these functions. This is the so-called power exponential function that is quite often used for that. And I have 4 different versions of the function with different parameter that is called phi here, and it's called spatial autocorrelation scale. And it tells you basically how quickly the autocorrelation decreases with the distance. So in other words, how far the autocorrelation affects the data. And these 4 values in the correlation function, it looks like this, and you can see real variables, simulated variables that are simulated using these autocorrelation functions exactly. So if the scale is 1, it's like very patchy, almost like random noise. If it would be 0, it's completely random noise. So in one cell of the, because this is raster, of course, so in one cell there will be values completely independent on the next cell. So you will see it like the black and white picture when in the old television, you know, that if there was no program, there was this war of black and white ants or whatever. So that's this, and if you increase the scale, it's like more and more smooth, and in the extreme forward with the spatial scale 50, the values 1 to 50 are they are relative. It's relative to how you measure the size of the window. And the size of this window is 100, so if the scale is 50, so it's like scale up to 1/2, and it creates something like this. I will use these scales and this like scale of scales from 1 to 50 throughout the presentation, so just keep this in mind. And now, what in ecology, of course, this problem of spatial autocorrelation is known for decades. It's not a new thing. Not only in ecology, of course, but generally in statistics. It's a major topic in the spatial statistics. So there are models that account for it. And there was this influential paper in 2007 from Karsten Dorman and many other authors, some of them very famous, that put together this review or overview about possible methods how to account for spatial autocorrelation. And it was a very influential paper that ecologists used as a basic reference, and they kind of were picking one of those methods to use in practice. And the range of methods is summarized here. So it could be I don't know if I should explain that. It depends on what background you have in statistics. Have you heard about generalized linear models? Yeah. Have you used them? Raise your hand if you used GLM. Okay. Okay, good. Have you used about mixed models? No? Some of you? Okay. So, but you probably haven't heard about generalized least squares models. No. Okay, never mind. It's not so important. So, briefly speaking, there is a range of models, range of approaches that can be used, and they may differ completely. Like sometimes you know that the statistical model usually have some some non-random fixed part, like the deterministic part, and then some random part. So you're trying to explain how the variable will depend on the predictor, like on average, like in its expected or mean value, and then how it will be vary along this mean behavior. And you may incorporate the spatial autocorrelation both in this fixed part of the model or in the random part, and this is one of the basic distinction between these approaches. And one possibility, for example, which is not surprisingly mentioned in this paper, is adding the coordinates as predictors. It's a very easy thing. So even if with GLM, you may do this. You may just add coordinates as predictors, and it somehow accounts for the spatial autocorrelation, but it's not always ideal approach. So the main message from this slide is that there are methods developed for that. There is a great variety of them, and I was interested in how much they really work for the problem. So I did some simulations, and the results are summarized here. So I used almost all of them, I think maybe really all of them that were mentioned in the list. And the simulation were done that I simulated completely independent variables in space distributed, like in those pictures that you saw before, and sampled them and fitted statistical models that were trying to find a relationship between them, even if they were independent. So I'm speaking about predictors and response, but actually the predictor is completely independent on the response. So there is no real relationship. And this is proportion of significant. It's similar to the plot from that paper that I showed you before. So how many times the relationship that is actually not there was found by the model as significant. And if this happens, it's because of the spatial autocorrelation. And I did this for different combinations of autocorrelation scale, for level of autocorrelation in response and in the predictor. So on the x-axis, you have the predictor spatial autocorrelation scales going exactly through the values 1, 5, 10, and 50, as you saw before. And the response spatial autocorrelation scale is in this blue scale. And you can see that, for example, this is linear model with no correction for spatial autocorrelation. It's just taking spatially autocorrelated data and analyzing them by linear model. And of course, this is wrong. And of course, you will find many times the relationship significant even if it's not there. This is not surprising. The same with generalized additive models, with random forest models. But starting with here, there are spatial models that should account for that. And generally, the result is that most of them they're sometimes better than this, than ignoring spatial autocorrelation, but they are kind of still, they should stay, in theory, below this line, which is 0.05. But they are frequently much higher, like this, like 20% of them were significant or more. For example, random forest with adding coordinates as predictors, it works even worse than just random forest without accounting for that. The only approach that really worked was the geostatistical models based on generalized least squares, which is not surprising for two reasons. First, it's the optimal approach how to model this data, according to not only to me, but it is, because it's designed exactly for this situation. And so I was very happy to find them working, but there is one tricky thing, because the data in GLS, in this geostatistical approach, you're basically really trying to find or fit the autocorrelation function that we saw a few slides before. Yeah, this function. So it's an approach that really works with this function, and you fit it to the data first. But you must know what kind of function you use, because this is the power exponential functions, and then you may try to fit its parameters. One of them is the parameter phi to the data. But you may use Matern correlation function, or I don't know, or spherical correlation function. There is plenty of them, and you don't know in forward what function to choose, but in the model you must decide. And the data in my simulations were also generated using the autocorrelation functions, and the GLS here uses the same autocorrelation function that was used to generate the data. So it's not surprising that it is successful to somehow describe or catch the autocorrelation in the data perfectly. So in the real situation, probably even the geostatistical models will perform a little bit worse than this. Okay, so lessons learned from this introductory part. The problem exists with spatial autocorrelation, and it's serious. It may really violate your results, or it may really create like fake positive significant result if you ignore it. Second, most of the spatial models cannot successfully beat the problem, which is not good, because generally what not only ecologists but scientists in general do, they just trust them because statisticians develop these models to do it. So if we use spatial models, we are fine. But and the general practice is that you look into the residuals, and if you don't find a residual autocorrelation, you think that you're fine. But it's not all. It's not only about the residual autocorrelation, it's also about the significance of the predictors, and they may be like fakely, let's say, significant, as I explained. Yeah, and actually, the problem, if your goal of your analysis is only to use your data to estimate the variable, the response variable somewhere in between your data, to interpolate it, like you frequently do for species distribution models, if you apply the model to the same area where you do the sampling, this might not be a problem actually, because you just use some variable, even if it's a fake variable, if it helps you to estimate or to interpolate the variables, okay, you may use it. And this is how it's used in geostatistics a lot. In geostatistics, they fit, for example, just a trend to the data. They add it to the deterministic component of the model without having some reason that there should be a trend or and so on. But the problem exists if you want to use the model to extrapolate either in space or in time, because these like fake relationships that you find between the variable that is in fact independent, the relationship holds there in the area where you find it, but it may completely not hold somewhere else, because then you are overlaying something else actually. And the same in time, it may change in time. And also, if you're interested really in the relationship themselves, to like in the beginning, the precipitation versus the species, these fake relationships can completely mislead you. Yeah, and the last point here is that the problem is actually in the statistical literature is resolved, but just for testing correlation, as I will explain in a while. But it is not successfully resolved, as we saw in the spatial model outputs, for multiple regression problem or this kind of modeling where you have response and multiple predictors and you're trying to relate them. And so the solution that exists is for correlation, and there are basically two approaches, as in any field of statistics. One is parametric, and one is non-parametric. The parametric solutions, they require some assumptions about the data, and then they apply some theory, some probabilistic theory to develop the proper tests. So, for example, for correlation, you may use modified sample size and like modified correlation tests that account for autocorrelation. This is implemented. There is an R package for that. The papers in the literature is old. It's from 80s. There's more paper than just this one, and more approaches, but yeah, it exists. There are also some other approaches, Vallejos, Sorio, and Vilacqua. They even wrote a book about it. But frequently, we want to have also non-parametric solutions, because the data, especially ecological data or field data in general, they don't meet the distributional assumptions. So non-parametric solutions are welcomed. And there is a non-parametric solution for correlation, and this is important because after a while I will present you my own solution to the problem, and it will be based to this basic idea that was developed already for correlation. And the basic idea is you consider you have two variables and you want to assess whether they are correlated. Okay? They are both spatial. You keep one fixed as it is, and you take the second one and you randomly shifted it. It means you shift the position of the point where you sample, and you sample the variable again, but you related these shifted values to the original value to the not shifted values of the original one. So it is something like if you shift one of those variables, or you may imagine that you have a raster of the second variable and you shift the whole raster, or you rotate the Earth, whatever. You just shift the values a little bit. What it means, then you kind of, if there is a structural relationship between the two variables, by shifting one somewhere randomly else, you break this relationship. You are relating the values of one variable to variables of to values of the other variable that from somewhere else. So any like structural relationship is broken. But because you shift all the points of the other variable, of all the sample points together, you keep their mutual position. So you're preserving the spatial autocorrelation structure in the other variable. So if you do this, let's say 1,000 times, and each time you compute correlation coefficient, you may somehow see what correlation coefficient you get from two autocorrelated variables that are not dependent, because each time you shift it, you break their relationship. And then you can compare the actual correlation coefficient that you measured in the original data, and you compare it against this distribution of independent cases. Is it clear? This is. I will have a picture about the shift in a while. Maybe I can. You can see it here. So, but I think you understand what I mean. So this is the variable. And the black points are the original sample points where you sampled it, and you just replace these values by values shifted in some direction, but you shift all the points in the same direction, so they go together. So their mutual positions are preserved. And these will be new values of that variable that you will relate to the other variable where you kept it fixed. Actually, this idea was originally developed in a different field of statistics, in spatial point pattern analysis. And then it was, this is where I kind of noticed it, and I had this idea it could be applied also for this. And then I found these papers about correlation that it was already done. There was kind of recently, 2 years ago, a paper by Czech authors about this random shift approach that included also correlation case. And there are other similar approaches about how to randomize the data. For example, this approach of Villadomat et al. Was doing something else than random shift. It took one variable was again kept fixed, and the other one, the values will just shuffled. So the positions of the points were kept the same, but they just like shuffled them, you know. So the actual values, and then they had to smooth these values so that the autocorrelation structure was more or less the same as in the original non-shuffled data. And in this way, they also like simulated new values that were independent structurally on the other variable, but had the same autocorrelation structure. Well, this is nice, it works, but the problem is that it's easy to do this for if you just have two variables, and if you can compute some test statistic like correlation coefficient each time you shuffle, and compare it with the null distribution. But I was thinking about how to extend this to a general modeling situation where you have response and multiple predictors with interactions, whatever, and also I don't know what I want to say. So how to extend this to this general, yeah, and also to the variety of models. So not only for linear models, but also for GLMs, for random forest, for GAMs, for anything. And this is what I developed. So the basic question that my solution is trying to solve is: could the observed relationship that you see be a result of a pure overlay of two independent but autocorrelated variables? Still the same question. And the approach is, again, keeping one variable fixed. And I've figured out that it's better to keep the response fixed, because then if you have multiple predictors, you make actually, no, that's not the case. You may do both. You may fix or whatever variable you want. Actually, if you keep the predictors fixed with multiple predictors, it's better, because then you can just randomize the response. And then you randomize the others. In this case, as it's written, the predictors. How to randomize it? There are multiple possibilities. I will start with the B, which is what I already explained. It's the random shift of the predictors. But I extended this a bit, because what is in the literature is just shifting. The shifting has some disadvantages. For example, usually if you have a raster of your original data, if you shift the points, some of the points may fall outside your area, and you don't have values for those points. And there are some corrections for that. One possibility is the so-called torus correction. So you can imagine that. Do I have a piece of paper? I don't know. No, it's not possible with this. Is there a piece of paper? No, okay, so I will, yeah, there is. So if this is your study area, and you're shifting points, and some of them fall outside, so the torus correction is that you actually do this with the paper. You join these edges together to form a cylinder. You know what I mean? It's not the best paper for that. And then you're fine with these edges, because if it's shifted, it appears at the other side. And then you do the same with this edge and this edge, and you create torus. And then wherever you shift, it's still inside the area. You know? Nice trick. And it's used in spatial point patterns. This is used. It's called torus translation test for testing independence of point pattern and some other predictor, length cover, for example. But the problem is that it doesn't work properly, because with this correction, when you shift through the edges, sometimes you break the mutual relationship, the relative position between the points. I don't want to going to the proof of that, but it's true. It's easy to show. So the torus correction is not ideal, so I didn't want to use it. But yeah, other correction would be that if the point fall outside, that you will try to estimate its values from other values. This is something that I have implemented. This is the C here, random shift and kriging, because kriging is a geostatistical method how to estimate, how to interpolate basically values of a variable for some unknown place. So you can do this, but my idea was, okay, what if I don't shift, but I rotate randomly? It has the same effect. I just break the mutual position of the response values and the predictor values, but the predictor, the rotation will keep the relative position of the rotated points, like among the rotated points. So I implemented also random rotation, and also I tried to combine this. So you first randomly rotate and then shift, so that you are pretty fine. You know that. Because the random shift has another problem, that if you accidentally shift in the direction of the spatial structure, you basically don't change anything. But you do this many times in different directions, so that's not a big problem. Okay, and there are another solution, because this solution with random shift is based on an assumption that you have the predictor values as a raster. So if you shift the points, you have new values from the raster. But what if also the predictor is measured only at the points, at the sample points? With the plant, you may measure the precipitation in the field at the same place as you measured as you sample the species. So in that case, one of the approaches that I tried was simulating the data there. If I know the spatial autocorrelation structure expressed as a spatial autocorrelation function, I may simulate completely new variable that will have exactly the same spatial autocorrelation properties, but will be independent on the original one. So this is what I also tried, either with like known autocorrelation function, or autocorrelation function that is estimated from the data. And actually, this approach finally worked only like in a limited way, only for linear relationships, which can be easily explained why. But then I also created this C approach, that you shift the positions and you estimate the values at new positions. Not only necessary. Before I said that you do this for the points that fall outside the raster, but even if you don't have any raster, you may shift the positions and estimate the new values from the original point values from your sample points. So this is called random shift and kriging. But I implemented this quite recently, and it's not included in the results that I present further, but it works equally well. So yeah. And now, what are the outputs of this method? This is just an illustration, but it's simulated, but the plots are really from this data. So again, I simulated a response and predictor here with spatial autocorrelation 5. So there is some spatial autocorrelation, but not so much. They are again independent, and the standard output assessed by a linear model without considering spatial structure at all would tell me, okay, there is a weak linear relationship between them, which is statistically significant. What my method is providing is this new kind of output, where, like here, this shaded area is the 95% confidence bands along this linear regression. But here, this is actually 95% confidence bands along this null model distribution. So it means that I simulated, as I explained before, I kept one variable fixed, this one in this case. I randomized 1,000 times the other, and each time I generated the regression line. And this shaded area is like 95% of space covered by all these regression lines. So the shaded area tells me what would happen just by chance, just by pure spatial autocorrelation operating here, and no structural relationship. And you can see that the observed relationship, which is the same red line as here, actually is inside the range of what could happen by chance. So you cannot say that it's a real relationship, because it could happen by chance. And you may compute an associated p-value, which is here 0.17, so it's not significant. So it basically provides a correction for spatial autocorrelation. And not only as a p-value, because it would be the same like the correlation correlation solution before. That is already described. But also you can have this like response curve visual assessment, let's say. This last picture is just the same, just saying that the slope of the line lies inside the distribution of null slopes, or null distribution of slopes caused by spatial autocorrelation only. And what happens if we have much stronger autocorrelation, 50? Then the relationship here is much more obvious, or much more like strong. P-value is practically 0, so there will be almost no doubt that they are independent. But my method again prove it as highly insignificant, because if you look at what is possible with such highly structured, highly autocorrelated surfaces, it's a whole range of slopes that could happen just by chance. So this slope is practically nothing. Here I demonstrated the method is applicable for all kinds of models. Here it's just linear model and random forest, but I think that if you show that something works for linear models and then for random forest, it's like two ends of the whole range of modeling strategies. So I have implemented this for many other models like GAMs, GLMs. That's it, I think. But random forest is like the most interesting one, so I included it here. So again, here you can see this practically the same like before. It's a linear relationship, but yeah, the difference here is that here the response is really dependent on the predictor. So I simulated real linear relationship with some noise. But I made them autocorrelated, both the predictor and response. And you can see that with low spatial autocorrelation, just one, the method proves the relationship as significant. It is significant, it was proven. So it's just like a counterexample that the method is not always tell that there is no relationship. It can work, but the same relationship simulated again, so this is like a new data, but from the same model as here, but with much higher autocorrelation, then you cannot prove it as significant. Because now the level of autocorrelation simply is too high to distinguish this real relationship from what could happen by chance. So you're kind of in a unlucky position. We know that there is a relationship because the data are simulated, but in reality we don't know. And if there is a high autocorrelation, we have no chance to decide. I demonstrate here that the method equally well work for nonlinear relationships. So this is linear model with quadratic terms, and the data are also simulated from quadratic relationship. So here we can somehow, like this is not like a proper statistical test, but it's very influential graphics, I think, that tells you if the red line, the observed relationship, really goes outside the shaded area, we see something that is more than chance. And here you can see that it's basically inside the shaded area. So the shaded area, again, tells us the whole range of quadratic relationships that could happen by chance. And here it's application of the same data, but for random forest model. Random forest model is very flexible. It can model any kind of nonlinearity in the relationship, so it looks like zigzag, strange line, but generally it captures this quadratic shape. And again, with low level of autocorrelation, you can prove it significant. With high level, you cannot. I tested the method. Oh, it's already 1 hour. Okay, we are almost done. So I will skip this a bit. I just explain for those that understand what kind of results it is, but I won't too much go to detail. So this is just type 1 error rate. So basically it's the same what we already saw here. So it's a proportion of significant if there is actually no relationship. So it should stay below 5% level. And the red line is the naive approach, is like the linear model without accounting for autocorrelation. So we can see the range of spatial autocorrelation scales in the response and in the predictor. And we can see how this naive approach is completely bad if the autocorrelation is larger. And you can see that all my randomizations that I included here solves the issue, like they stay safely below the 5% level. So type 1 error rate is fine. What about statistical power? What if there is relationship? Is the method able to prove it significant? So I simulated dependent data. Response is dependent on the predictor, but there is some additional error, of course, some random part. And this alpha parameter just controls the signal-to-noise ratio. So you can see it here that if alpha is very low, then the simulated data are following really the linear relationship with almost no noise. If the alpha increases, then the noise is larger, and even here there is a linear relationship, but it is maybe masked by the error. So I simulated data for different levels of alpha, and again, this is statistical power. So it's 1 minus the probability of type 2 error, which is the probability that it's basically probability that you find the significant results. So it's the same, basically. It's the proportion of significant results. So all of the models are significant, so we should basically stay at 1 or as close to 1 as possible. Which, for example, the naive approach is best in this way. And of course, the power decreases with the level of noise. It happens normally. Like if you have a lot of noise, the relationship, even if it's there, is hard to prove. So it's not surprising that the naive approach has the highest power, but it's with the cost of this, of proving also non-significant, proving also independent case as significant. So it is not surprising that these methods accounting for autocorrelation has lower power, but they are still able to work somehow. The rotation and shift approach is actually best from the random shift. So the idea about adding rotation instead of shift or adding rotation to the shift was proven to be quite helpful. And the best are the simulations here, simulated data. That sometimes for some level of spatial autocorrelation scales, they are even comparable to the naive approach like this, like here. Well, the real data example, it will be very short. It's just 6 slides, but 5 slides. So I took data from splot, Open Vegetation Plot Database. You might know it. You know it? Do you know this vegetation database or not? Raise your hand if yes. Okay, some of you, few of you. So it's a database of vegetation plots, obviously. I don't know it so much. I used it only here and never before and never after. But basically, it creates a lot of vegetation plots with a lot of data. So I just created species richness for records inside Europe. It was more than 35,000 records. and I just counted how many species are there. And I tried to explain this by like the spatial distribution of species richness by wind speed. It's obvious, right? Of course, it's intentionally selected because it doesn't make any sense, at least to me, that species of plant species richness should somehow be explained by wind speed. Of course, it may be explained by something that is correlated to wind speed. That's true. Like usually for species richness, it's always like a water content and energy, so temperature or sun energy or whatever. So, but I intentionally took wind speed because I was interested whether these two variables that I would expect that wouldn't be related are related or not. This is the output of, in this case, Poisson GLM. And it doesn't look like that, but it includes confidence interval. So the R squared is 30%, and p-value is practically 0. I think that anyone would immediately go and publish a paper about it, getting such a highly significant result. But of course, maybe it's because of spatial autocorrelation, because if you look at these plots, like this is obviously very spatially autocorrelated. From the richness, we cannot say because we just see the points, but richness is usually also highly spatially autocorrelated because it's based on some population ranges that are, each species like is covering some area where it belongs, and these population ranges overlap. So basically, species richness doesn't change very abruptly in space. So if this is a real relationship, we might expect that it would hold even in some smaller area. It would hold, if this should hold in the whole Europe, we can expect that if we project the relationship from space somewhere else, we should still see the same relationship, because the relationship is structural between wind speed somehow and species richness. If not, if it's just by autocorrelation, we might see that if we fit the model at some area and then in some other area, the relationship might be different if it's just caused by spatial autocorrelation, because accidentally we overlay like a different parts of those two surfaces, and they may go in different way, different direction. So I fitted the same model in individual countries, and this is the variety of relationships I got. So, so you can see that you may basically find any kind of relationship, positive, negative, no relationship, whatever you want. Of course, this like spatial autocorrelation is not the only possible explanation for this. There is also a so-called Simpson paradox. You might heard about it. If not, Google it. It's a very cool thing. So simple paradox can do this as well. If you fit something on the whole data set and then on some limited subsample of it, you may find different relationship because there is something else operating that you don't include. And that, so basically the subset that you use is not representative for the whole sample. But I was trying to then apply my method to see if the autocorrelation is the cause. So I present this only for a few countries because the plots are bigger. So I was doing this in my state in Portugal, so Portugal is first. And yeah, there's Czech Republic and a couple of other countries. So this is the original relationships fitted by linear models. They're all significant, highly significant. You can see the R squares. Only Italy has very low R square. maybe, but it's still significant. So the variation along of the data is quite high. But yeah, and Czech Republic also, the value is not here. I'm sorry, because it's cut it by, there's no space for it. But it's less than 0.09, obviously, or less than 0.1. But some R-squares, like Hungary, is 91%. So very strong relationship. And then I applied my method, and I found this. So here you see also the data. But you can see here p-values based on my method and the range of what could happen by chance. And let's say, okay, Portugal is at the edge of significance, but it's not significant. And it's seen here. It's like inside, but at the edge. And the only significant is Hungary, which was kind of obvious from the high R squared that it could be really some relationship. So in Hungary, there is some relationship between species richness and wind speed, probably not because of wind speed, but because of some other variables that is correlated with wind speed. But in other countries, you cannot say that, and you're free of trying to find an explanation for that, because you know that it might happen just by spatial autocorrelation. So you can go home. I don't mean it literally. Okay, that's it, that's all. So I'm open for your questions now.
Thank you for this nice presentation. I guess that there will be questions. We have to use this, include spatial structure into our model.
I didn't, because this was just like an example to, to have in the presentation, have some real data example, but it would be definitely important, like then to try even something that makes sense, because you may find, even there, you may find that you cannot distinguish it from chance, from spatial autocorrelation effect. So, and that's actually what was shown in these papers, in this like Chapman's paper, that he used it's actually what I'm doing is in a way is the same what he was doing. He was comparing the classical models with real variables and with those simulated variables. It's actually principally the same. By randomizations, the predictors, I'm creating these fake predictors, and I'm comparing the observed significance with this significance of the fake predictors that have the same structure as the original ones. So when he found 80% of fake predictors significant, then he could somehow say that if also the real predictors had 80% of significance, then probably it means nothing. So it's conceptually is the same. But it may happen then we will be probably sometimes maybe in a situation where even if the model makes sense, so the found relationship is what we would expect by theory or by how the species should or species richness should behave. You might see that you couldn't distinguish the effect from the pure spatial autocorrelation effect. So. With the classical models. But my method is exactly for correcting for that. Or was your impression from what? From the last example? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, may happen. It's sad, but it's honest. Um, yeah, I'm not sure if I understand what you're actually asking, like whether this, yeah, uh, actually, I'm not sure if all of this can be easily implemented in a Bayesian way. Probably yes, but I don't have too much experience with that. And definitely, I'm not sure if it's then more simpler, because it's a matter of opinion whether Bayesian approaches are simpler. Uh, they are maybe simpler theoretically sometimes, but maybe not practically, because you may do much more stuff, for example, with MCMC approaches. But yeah, some of them definitely can be done. Like generalized least squares, like geostatistical methods have their Bayesian versions, definitely. Hmm. Yeah, but the thing is that, like, what I want maybe should stress out is that uh, my method is not comparable to these techniques, because these are really models that then you can use for predictions and so on. You can, and you have somehow evaluation of the uncertainty with your parameter estimates or with your response curves estimates and so on. But my method is just a test whether the observed relationship is different from what you can expect by chance. But the result of it is not a model fitted to data that you can then use further. That's, yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wonder whether you thought about using some variation partitioning between the effect of space and the effect of variables, like dependent variable relationship, which is independent of space. Because
Mhm.
what you are doing basically is that you remove the spatial component or spatial autocorrelation component from the model.
Mhm.
And if the relationship between variables can be explained by spatial autocorrelation, then you make a conclusion that there is no relationship between the variables.
No, that's not
You
the
are not able
conclusion.
to say that, yeah.
Yeah.
But
The
I
conclusion is that you cannot
understood
prove it.
so.
Yeah.
But well, the relationship can still be there, and I would be interested in defining or quantifying the component of like pure spatial autocorrelation, then possible pure effect of the relationship between the variables, and the shared effect of
Mhm.
like autocorrelation
Yeah.
and the causal relationship.
This is definitely possible, and it's sometimes used. Recently we used this approach in one paper that we have in a review, and there was also one paper, but I saw it just as a preprint. I'm not sure if it was published already, from my colleague Peter Kale and some others that were that they will do like a huge simulation study to exactly to see whether how much this works or not. But it's a I think it's a great tool, variation partitioning with a spatial component. But the problem is that very often, if your other predictors are spatially structured, spatially autocorrelated, you see a large shared part, and that's the problem, because there is a basically multicollinearity between the space and the other predictors. And then you are still in the position like, and this multicollinearity affects your tests, your p-values, your standard errors, and it's hard to decide whether it is significant or not, or whether you can make the conclusions. Okay, that's so you mean for you mean that actually it's not what's the term for that? Basically, that it changes. The autocorrelation can change over space. Yeah, that's true. And if this happens, that's a very complicated situation for generally for modeling. But yeah, it may affect my approach definitely, because then like the shifting approach is basically based on an assumption of stationarity, so that the spatial autocorrelation operates more or less the same in all parts of the space. But for not all of them actually. I'm thinking, because I didn't think about it before, but I think that some of the randomization approaches, like the simulation approach or the Kriging approach, are actually not affecting by that. Because you're like, in the randomization, you're replacing the original values by new ones that are simulated or estimated, like if they were from some shifted positions, but they're actually, you may consider them as like new values estimated at that point. So, yeah, but maybe you wanted to say more in the question? Yeah, but definitely like if it, yeah. Especially if you consider such large scale, large extent like whole Europe and so on. Yeah, it's true. But I don't see like an easy solution for this. And of course, this would be a problem even if you apply some of the standard methods. And unfortunately, the method that is here looks like the best one is actually based on the same assumptions of stationarity. But other methods like those that include coordinates as a predictors, that they don't have this assumption. That's a big advantage of them, like for example GEM with spatial component. But it's not so perfect as you see. Mm-hmm.
In any case, you have to put some threshold as a maximum shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I would expect that if the shifting distance is relatively small, then you don't remove all the spatial autocorrelation. While when it's large, then your model may remove it completely.
Mm-hmm.
So
but you may be outside your area and you don't have any values.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So how do you decide about it, and how does it influence the results?
Yeah, that's true. Actually, this is a problem that is not like enough discussed even in the literature about random shift approaches. I wasn't satisfied by that, because and actually also my idea about random shift and Kriging, there is the same problem, because the Kriging is based on the spatial autocorrelation. The more is there spatial autocorrelation, the better is the estimate for but not for large distances. So if there is not spatial autocorrelation and you do Kriging, you're actually the estimation is not so good, and it's kind of like a circular reasoning, you know. But I think that this is one of the things where the random rotation makes much better work, because with random shift you have like an infinity of distances available in theory, and how to decide what's the threshold is really, really hard. And if you do the torus translation, the torus correction, then it doesn't matter, because you have like you're shifting on a circle basically. So wherever you shift, you always like end up inside the study area. Of course, the very small shifts maybe have this problem, but if you do the whole range of shifts, the small shifts will be just few of them, you know. So it's just a small part of it, and the same applies for random rotation. So I think that with random rotation, you have the whole variability of moving the data.
But anyway, with random rotation, the points that are close to the center of rotation will not be shifted
That's true.
such a big distance. So if there is some center of correlation in the center of your space, then it doesn't help so much, because you are basically only shifting, or not only, but the fire shifts near the distant quarks or marginal quarks of your study area.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So finally, I have combination of both. Yeah, but these considerations are valid, definitely. But like so far, my experience with the method was that it's not like it works very well. So it's maybe not such a big deal as we could expect by these concerns. But definitely, my plan is, when I finally publish this basic version of it, go more deeply into these details and investigate the effect of this shift radius. And thank you for this note that the rotation is different for, of course, for the points close to the center. I didn't realize that. That's obvious. Yes, I do have an R package, but it's not made public yet. It's almost prepared. Yeah. Any other questions?
There is no one online. They use a stream, and they can follow it, but they are not able to speak with us. So better to be here.
It looks that I explained everything so well that no one has any doubts. Mm-hmm. You mean autocorrelated or correlated? Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but these are two questions. Like whether you have direct causal relationships or indirect causal relationships, it's another question that is not addressed by this. This is about like whether it's structural, which includes both of these, or purely spatial. And definitely, like, I'm not saying that my method should be applied everywhere. I'm saying that whenever you have spatial data, you have to check for autocorrelation. And if you find that, you should use some spatial approaches, some spatial models. One possibility is this method that is non-parametric, and that can tell you whether the space is masking whatever else might be there. so how much it's a concern. Yeah, and the other approaches are those that I listed. But definitely, this should be like a I don't know, iron rule. The spatial data must be checked for autocorrelation, and temporal data as well, of course. With temporal data, no one. I think it's more common. Like whoever works with spatial with time series, autocorrelation is always checked. But with spatial data, it's better and better. I think now it's more common, but you can still find examples where people just ignore it.
So once again, thank you very much for this nice presentation.
Thank you.